One family ruled without interruption for 623 years. Not a city, not a kingdom. An empire that at its height stretched across 3 continents, from the gates of Vienna to the shores of the Persian Gulf, from the Barbary coast of North Africa to the mountains of the Caucasus. A single bloodline supplied every ruler of that empire, without exception, for over 6 centuries, longer than the Plantagenets, longer than the Romanovs, longer than almost any other dynasty that has ever held power anywhere on earth. They conquered Constantinople and ended a Roman Empire that had already outlasted the western half of Rome by 1,000 years. They laid siege to Vienna twice, and for a time genuinely threatened to bring the heart of Catholic Europe under the rule of an Islamic sultan. They ruled Mecca and Medina, held the title of Caliph of Islam, commanded the Mediterranean's most feared navy, and governed, at their peak, tens of millions of subjects across dozens of languages, religions, and cultures. And they began as almost nothing at all, a few hundred nomadic horsemen, camped on a frontier so unremarkable that the Byzantine Empire they were about to spend 2 centuries dismantling didn't even bother learning their leader's name. This is the story of the House of Osman, the dynasty that gave its name to the Ottoman Empire, and the family whose private decisions, marriages, murders, and reforms shaped world history for over 600 years. And at the center of that story sits a genuinely uncomfortable truth. This family did not survive 6 centuries by being consistently virtuous, or consistently strong, or consistently wise. They survived by building, generation after generation, brutally effective solutions to whatever problem threatened them most, and every single one of those solutions eventually became a liability that helped bring the whole structure down. The same family that built an empire by solving yesterday's problems would, 3 centuries later, be undone by refusing to let go of yesterday's solutions. Before we get into how a minor frontier warlord's descendants ended up ruling 3 continents, hit subscribe. There's a lot more of this kind of deep dive coming, and you won't want to miss where this one goes. Picture yourself on the edge of Byzantine Anatolia, somewhere in the last years of the 13th century. The Seljuk state that once brought order to this region is collapsing, gutted by Mongol invasions sweeping in from the east. Byzantine authority, just a short ride away, is a shadow of what it once was, a fading empire clinging to a scattering of fortified towns. In the middle of this power vacuum sits a minor Turkic chieftain, the son of a warband leader, commanding perhaps a few hundred mounted warriors on a strip of contested frontier nobody important is watching closely. If you'd stood in that camp and been told this man's descendants would one day rule Constantinople, Cairo, Baghdad, and Belgrade, would you have believed it? Let me know in the comments and keep that question in the back of your mind, because by the end of this documentary, the answer might surprise you. To understand why the House of Osman succeeded where so many comparable frontier dynasties simply vanished from history, you first have to understand just how much chaos surrounded their birth. Because this was not a family that rose in a stable world. It rose directly out of the collapse of one. For roughly 2 centuries before Osman's birth, the dominant Turkic power in Anatolia had been the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, a state that had carved out territory from the Byzantine Empire following a landmark victory at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, a defeat so significant that it effectively opened the interior of Asia Minor to permanent Turkic settlement for the first time. By the mid-13th century, though, the Seljuks themselves were buckling under a far more terrifying force, sweeping in from the east. The Mongol invasions, which shattered Seljuk authority and sent waves of displaced Turkic tribes fleeing westward, deeper into Anatolia, in search of land, safety, and opportunity. One of those displaced tribal leaders was a man named Ertuğrul, head of a clan identified with the Kayu branch of the Oghuz Turks. Ertuğrul led his people west, arriving eventually in the region of Suut, in northwestern Anatolia, close to the last edge of Byzantine territory still standing between the Turkic tribes of the interior and the waters of the Sea of Marmara. Here, under the nominal authority of the crumbling Seljuk state, Ertuğrul established a small principality, a beylik in the terminology of the era, one of dozens of similar minor Turkic statelets that had sprung up across Anatolia in the vacuum the Seljuks were leaving behind. It's worth pausing on that detail, because it's easy to let it slide past as a footnote. The Ottomans did not begin as the strongest, best positioned, or most obviously destined of these Anatolian beyliks. They were one competitor among many, in a crowded and violent field, with no particular reason to expect they would be the ones still standing 6 centuries later, while every rival principality around them was absorbed, conquered, or forgotten. Ertuğrul's son, born around 1258 in Suut, was named Osman, and it is from his name, rendered into Arabic as Uthman, that both the dynasty and the empire it built would eventually take their name. Osman's own rise to leadership is wrapped in a legend that Ottoman court historians would later polish into something closer to scripture than history, but which is worth telling regardless, because the Ottomans themselves clearly believed it mattered enough to preserve. According to this tradition, the young Osman came under the spiritual guidance of a respected local mystic named Sheikh Edebali, and one night, while staying as a guest in Edebali's house, Osman dreamed a vivid and unmistakably symbolic dream. A moon rose from the chest of the sleeping sheikh and sank into Osman's own body, and from that spot a great tree grew, its branches spreading outward until they covered the entire world, its roots giving rise to rivers that watered every corner of it. When Osman told the dream to Edebali the next morning, the sheikh reportedly interpreted it as nothing less than a divine sign. Osman and his descendants were destined to rule a vast and enduring empire. Not long after, Osman married Edebali's daughter, Malhun Hatun, a union that bound the young warlord's political ambitions to genuine religious legitimacy in the eyes of his followers, a spiritual seal of approval that mattered enormously in a frontier society where legitimacy was still very much up for grabs. Whether or not the dream happened exactly as later chroniclers described it, the marriage to Edebali's daughter was real, and it captures something genuinely important about how Osman operated from the very beginning. He understood that raw military force alone would not be enough to build something that lasted. He needed the loyalty of holy men, the backing of fellow tribal leaders, and a story his followers could believe in about who they were and what they were destined to become. He was not, however, a man who ruled by gentleness alone. One story preserved by later Ottoman chroniclers describes a council Osman called in 1299, at which he announced his intention to attack a nearby fortress held by Byzantine forces. His own uncle, an elderly man who had marched alongside Osman's father decades earlier, spoke up in opposition, warning that the attack risked provoking the surrounding Turkish and Greek rulers alike, and could bring ruin down on the entire tribe. According to the chronicle, Osman said nothing in response. He simply killed his uncle on the spot, in front of the assembled council, as an unmistakable demonstration of what disagreement with his authority would cost. It's a brutal story, and it's entirely possible later chroniclers exaggerated or invented it to make a point about Osman's ruthlessness. But whether or not it happened exactly as described, it captures a pattern that would define this dynasty for the next 6 centuries. From its very first recorded moment of decisive leadership, the House of Osman treated internal opposition, even from its own blood relatives, as a threat to be eliminated rather than a disagreement to be managed. Long before any formal law demanded it, the instinct for lethal family discipline was already present in the dynasty's founder. That same year, 1299, is the date Ottoman tradition marks as the formal beginning of Osman's independent rule, the moment he stopped operating as a nominal Seljuk vassal and began acting as the sovereign head of his own state. 3 years later, in 1302, Osman's forces won a genuinely significant victory over a Byzantine army at the Battle of Baphius, a win that did more than expand his territory. It announced for the first time that this particular frontier lord was not merely another raiding warband to be tolerated and ignored, but a rising power capable of beating Byzantine soldiers in open battle. Refugees, adventurers, and fellow Turkic warriors, many of them Ghazis, frontier fighters who combined religious motivation with the very practical appeal of land and plunder, began flocking to Osman's banner in growing numbers, drawn by his victories and by the reputation for both justice and ruthlessness that was starting to precede him. Osman would go on to rule for roughly another 2 decades, gradually extending his control over former Byzantine strongholds in the region, before his death around 1323 or 1326. He did not live to see his followers capture Bursa, the first genuinely major city his dynasty would conquer, and the place that would become the Ottomans' first real capital. But he came remarkably close, and the campaign that finally took the city was one his own son had been pressing for years before it succeeded. So the question worth carrying into the next chapter is the same one this documentary will keep returning to. Out of every ambitious frontier lord scrambling for territory in the wreckage of Seljuk Anatolia in these same years, why was it Osman's small, obscure beylik that would still be standing and ruling 3 continents 600 years later? The answer begins with what his son did next. Turning a warband built for raiding into something that had never quite existed before in this form. A permanent, professional war machine, loyal to nothing and no one except the dynasty itself. Osman's son Orhan inherited leadership of the beylik around 1323 or 1326, and almost immediately achieved the conquest his father had spent years working toward: the capture of Bursa, a substantial and strategically vital Byzantine city that Osman's forces had been besieging for close to a decade. Orhan made Bursa his capital, and with it, the Ottoman beylik stopped looking like a nomadic warband with a base camp and started looking like something closer to an actual state, one with a treasury, a fixed seat of government, and a city wealthy enough to fund whatever came next. What came next was expansion on a scale Osman himself had never approached. Orhan's forces pushed further into former Byzantine Anatolia, absorbing rival Turkish principalities along the way, and, in a move whose consequences would echo for the next 5 centuries, began crossing into Europe itself. By 1354, Ottoman forces had secured a foothold on the European side of the Dardanelles, the narrow strait separating Asia from Europe, giving this Anatolian frontier dynasty its first permanent presence on European soil. It was the opening move in what would become one of the most sustained and successful campaigns of territorial expansion in medieval history. But territorial conquest alone doesn't explain why the Ottomans, uniquely among the era's rising powers, managed to keep expanding for the better part of 3 uninterrupted centuries. The deeper explanation lies in an institution that took shape during this same formative period and would go on to define Ottoman military and administrative power for hundreds of years: the Devshirme system and the elite fighting force it eventually produced, the Janissaries. Here's the problem the Devshirme system was designed to solve. Every medieval and early modern state faced the same structural danger. An army built from the sons of powerful noble families is an army whose loyalty ultimately belongs to those families first, and to the ruler only second. Local lords who supply troops expect influence in return, and a state that depends on feudal levies is perpetually vulnerable to the ambitions of the very aristocrats supplying its soldiers. The Ottomans arrived at a strikingly radical solution to this problem. Instead of relying on the empire's own free Muslim subjects or established noble families for their most elite troops, they began systematically conscripting young Christian boys, largely from conquered territories in the Balkans, taking them from their families through a periodic levy, converting them to Islam, and raising them from childhood inside a rigorous system of military and administrative training entirely controlled by the state. These boys owed no allegiance to any competing noble house, because the entire system was deliberately designed to sever them from their birth families and communities. Their only loyalty, their only path to status, wealth, and advancement ran through one channel: personal service to the Sultan himself. Some of the most talented among them were funneled into elite administrative training, eventually rising to become provincial governors or even grand viziers, the empire's most powerful ministers. Others were trained as soldiers from boyhood, forged into a standing, professional infantry corps that had genuinely no equivalent anywhere else in the medieval world at the time it was created, permanently under arms, paid a regular salary rather than dependent on plunder, and answerable to no one but the throne. These were the Janissaries, the name derived from the Turkish yeniçeri, meaning, fittingly, new soldiers. It's difficult to overstate how much of an advantage this gave the early Ottoman state over its rivals. While Christian European kingdoms in this same era were still largely dependent on feudal levies, armies raised from semi-independent nobles who might show up late, leave early, or simply refuse to fight a war that didn't serve their own interests. The Ottomans were assembling something closer to a modern standing army centuries before most of Europe would manage the same thing. Loyal, disciplined, permanently available, and utterly dependent on the Sultan for their entire status in life, the Janissaries would become the backbone of Ottoman military expansion for the next 200 years. The institution reached full maturity under Orhan's son, Murad I, who succeeded to leadership of the growing state in 1362. Murad pressed the European conquests further and faster than his father had, subjugating Bulgaria after a decisive victory at the Battle of Sırp-Sındır in 1365, and forcing Serbia into vassalage following the Battle of Maritsa in 1371. He also captured and fortified the city of Edirne, which would go on to serve as the Ottoman capital for the better part of the next century, giving the dynasty a genuine foothold deep inside the Balkan Peninsula, rather than merely a bridgehead across the water. Murad's reign and the whole first phase of Ottoman expansion reached its defining climax on the field of Kosovo in June 1389, where Ottoman forces confronted a coalition of Serbian and allied Balkan nobles determined to halt the Ottoman advance once and for all. The battle itself remains genuinely contested by historians in its precise details and outcome. Both sides would later claim victory, and the fog of medieval battlefield reporting makes a clean verdict elusive even today. What is not contested is that Murad I did not survive it. According to the most widely repeated account, a Serbian nobleman named Miloš Obilić infiltrated the Ottoman camp after the main fighting under the pretense of defecting and assassinated the Sultan with a hidden blade before being killed himself by Murad's guards. It was a genuinely unprecedented moment for the young dynasty. The reigning Sultan, killed on campaign, in the middle of what may well have been the most consequential battle the Ottomans had fought to date. And yet, remarkably, the succession held. Murad's son Bayezid, present on the same battlefield, immediately assumed command and completed the victory his father had not lived to see finished. A seamless transition of power in the middle of active combat that speaks to just how much institutional stability this still young dynasty had already managed to build in less than a century. Bayezid inherited, in other words, an empire that was no longer a frontier experiment. It had a professional army answerable directly to the throne, a capital deep in conquered European territory, and a track record of expansion that showed no sign of slowing. What it did not yet have was the wisdom, in its new and ambitious young sultan, to recognize the difference between an enemy that could be safely provoked and one that could not. Bayezid I earned his nickname honestly. Ottoman chroniclers and European observers alike came to know him as Yildirim, the Thunderbolt, for the sheer speed and aggression with which he moved his armies across the Balkans and Anatolia in the years following his father's death at Kosovo. Within a decade of taking the throne, Bayezid had annexed most of the remaining independent Turkish principalities of Anatolia, effectively unifying the region under direct Ottoman rule for the first time, while simultaneously pressing the empire's European conquests deeper into the Balkans. His most famous victory in these years came in 1396, near the Danube fortress town of Nicopolis, where Bayezid's forces crushed a large crusading army raised by King Sigismund of Hungary, with support from across Western Europe, French, Burgundian, German, and other Christian nobility, all mobilized in one of the last major crusades of the medieval era, specifically to check the growing Ottoman threat to Christian Europe. Bayezid's decisive victory at Nicopolis didn't just eliminate that immediate threat. It sent an unmistakable signal across the continent. The Ottoman Empire was no longer a regional nuisance to be managed. It was now one of the most formidable military powers in the entire Mediterranean world, capable of crushing the best that Western European chivalry could muster in open battle. It was also, in retrospect, the peak of Bayezid's fortune, because even as he was expanding the empire west and consolidating it across Anatolia, a far more dangerous rival was building an empire of his own, far to the east, and the two men's ambitions were on a collision course neither seemed willing to avoid. That rival was Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, a Turco-Mongol conqueror who had spent decades building one of the largest and most destructive empires in Central Asian history, claiming descent from Genghis Khan and backing that claim with a military record of conquest and calculated brutality across Persia, the Caucasus, and beyond. By the start of the 15th century, Timur's westward campaigns had brought him into direct contact and direct rivalry with the eastern frontier of Bayezid's own expanding domain. The two rulers exchanged a series of increasingly hostile and insulting letters over several years, each apparently unwilling to back down from a confrontation that neither, in the end, could avoid. The two armies finally met on the 20th of July, 1402, on the plain of Chubuk, near the city of Ankara, and by nearly every account, the two forces arriving on that field were far more evenly matched on paper than the outcome would suggest. Timur's army is estimated to have numbered somewhere in the region of 140,000 men, a substantial portion of it heavy cavalry, supported by dozens of war elephants brought all the way from his campaigns in India, a genuinely fearsome and, for the Ottomans, entirely unfamiliar sight on a European or Anatolian battlefield. Bayezid's own army, estimated at somewhere between 85,000 and 120,000, was no rabble either. It included his elite Janissary infantry at the center, a wing of heavily armored Serbian knights under the command of the Christian vassal Prince Stefan Lazarevich, and additional forces drawn from the Anatolian beyliks Bayezid had spent the previous decade conquering and absorbing into his own empire. That last detail matters enormously because it points directly to the single greatest weakness in Bayezid's entire battle plan, and Timur, characteristically, had already found a way to exploit it before a single arrow was loosed. In the days before the battle, Timur's forces seized and diverted the Chubuk Creek, the region's principal water source, denying it to the Ottoman camp and leaving Bayezid's already exhausted army parched under the punishing heat of the Anatolian summer. Bayezid's own generals reportedly urged caution, arguing that the Sultan should hold a defensive position and force Timur's larger army to come to him, rather than risk an offensive strike in the open field. Bayezid, ever the thunderbolt, chose to attack anyway. What happened next turned a difficult battle into an outright catastrophe. Several of the Anatolian beys fighting under Bayezid's banner that day were men whose own principalities Bayezid himself had conquered and forcibly annexed only years, or in some cases only months, earlier. Proud local rulers reduced to vassals serving under the very sultan who had stripped them of their independent thrones. As the battle turned against the Ottomans, a significant number of these Anatolian contingents simply switched sides mid-fight, abandoning Bayezid's lines and joining Timur's forces outright. A betrayal made possible by the very speed and ruthlessness with which Bayezid had built his Anatolian holdings in the first place. The men Bayezid had conquered too quickly to ever fully win over turned against him at the single worst possible moment, in the middle of the battlefield, with Timur's cavalry already pressing hard against his exhausted lines. Even as his center buckled and his own recent conquests defected around him, Bayezid's Serbian vassal troops fought with a loyalty that stood in stark contrast to the collapsing Anatolian wing. Stefan Lazarevich's knights reportedly broke through Timur's lines not once but 3 separate times in a desperate effort to reach and extract the Sultan. And it was these same Serbian forces who ultimately managed to save one of Bayezid's own sons and a portion of the Ottoman treasury from the wreck of the battle, even as the Sultan himself refused Lazarevich's urging to flee alongside them. Timur's forces broke the remaining Ottoman lines decisively, and Bayezid himself, along with a small band of remaining horsemen, retreated into the surrounding mountains, only to find Timur's cavalry had already encircled the high ground. He was surrounded and captured, becoming, in the process, the only Ottoman sultan in the dynasty's entire 6th-century history ever taken prisoner by an enemy. What happened next has become the stuff of enduring, grim legend. According to widely repeated tradition, Timur kept the defeated sultan in captivity inside an iron cage, paraded as a trophy of conquest, a humiliation almost impossible to overstate for a ruler who, only years earlier, had been crushing crusader armies and unifying Anatolia under his own banner. Whether or not the literal cage is historical fact or later embellishment, what is certain is that Bayezid never regained his freedom. He died in captivity in March 1403, less than a year after his capture. The empire he had spent over a decade expanding suddenly leaderless, its sultan gone, its army shattered, and its most dangerous rival in living memory now sitting unchallenged at the head of an army camped deep inside former Ottoman territory. For a moment, it must have looked to observers across the region as though the entire Ottoman project, barely a century old, was about to collapse as suddenly as it had risen. It very nearly did. Timur, however, proved to be more interested in plunder and prestige than in permanent conquest. After spending roughly a year ravaging the Anatolian countryside, his forces withdrew eastward, leaving behind not a conquered Ottoman state under Timurid administration, but a power vacuum and a shattered dynasty whose surviving princes, Bayezid's own sons, immediately turned their remaining forces against one another in a bitter contest for what was left of their father's empire. This period, which historians call the Ottoman interregnum, would drag on for 11 brutal years, as Bayezid's sons, Suleiman, Musa, Mehmed, and others, fought a rolling, shifting civil war across Ottoman territory, each securing temporary control of different regions, forming and breaking alliances with Christian Balkan rulers and rival Turkish beys alike, in a contest with no guarantee that the House of Osman would emerge from it still ruling anything at all. It was not until 1413, more than a decade after the disaster at Ankara, that one of Bayezid's sons, Mehmed, finally succeeded in defeating his remaining brothers and reunifying the fractured empire under his own sole rule as Sultan Mehmed I. The empire that emerged from this decade of civil war was, remarkably, not permanently weakened by the experience. If anything, historians generally regard 1413 as the true starting point of the Ottoman Empire's rise to genuine world power status. The moment the dynasty proved, for the first time, that it could survive not just the death of a single sultan on the battlefield, as it had at Kosovo, but the outright military destruction of its army and the capture of its ruler, and still come back stronger than before. That resilience, the ability to absorb a catastrophic, near-fatal blow and rebuild rather than disintegrate, would prove to be one of the House of Osman's defining and most consequential traits. It's also worth noting what the Ankara disaster reveals, in hindsight, about the fragility hiding underneath the dynasty's early successes. Without any fixed rule governing succession, the death or incapacity of a single sultan could instantly plunge the entire state into a fight for survival among his own sons. The Ottomans had built an extraordinarily effective machine for conquest. They had not yet solved the much harder problem of what happens when that machine's leadership is suddenly, violently up for grabs. It would take another 50 years, and the ambitions of one of the most consequential rulers in the dynasty's entire history, before that problem received a solution so ruthless it would define Ottoman succession politics for the next 2 centuries, and one that was first put into practice at the gates of the greatest city in the Christian world. The empire Mehmed I restored in 1413 was alive, but it was not yet the unstoppable force it would become. The wounds of the interregnum were still fresh. The Ottomans had survived the disaster at Ankara, but survival was not the same as dominance. The dynasty had recovered its throne, yet enemies across both Anatolia and Europe were still watching for any sign that the House of Osman could be weakened again. The responsibility of rebuilding that power fell to Mehmed I's son, Murad II, who became sultan in 1421 at only 17 years old. His reign began with the same problem that had haunted the dynasty for decades, a challenge to the legitimacy of the sultan himself. A man named Mustafa Çelebi appeared claiming to be Bayezid I's long-lost son, returning from the chaos that followed the Battle of Ankara. Whether he was truly who he claimed to be or not, his cause attracted powerful supporters, including the Byzantine Empire and other regional rivals who saw an opportunity to divide the Ottomans once again. For a young sultan who had inherited an empire only recently reunited after 11 years of civil war, the threat was extremely dangerous. If Mustafa succeeded, the Ottoman state could have fallen back into another succession struggle before it had even recovered from the first. Murad responded with speed. He defeated Mustafa's forces, captured the pretender, and eliminated one of the last major threats to his authority. Unlike his grandfather Bayezid, who had expanded faster than he could fully consolidate, Murad understood that rebuilding the empire required stability before ambition. Once his position was secure, Murad turned toward the greatest prize that had fascinated Ottoman rulers for generations: Constantinople. In 1422, he launched a major siege against the Byzantine capital. Ottoman armies surrounded the city and attacked its legendary walls, but once again, Constantinople proved to be the fortress that refused to fall. The same Theodosian walls that had stopped countless enemies for nearly 1,000 years held firm against the Ottoman assault, and Murad was forced to withdraw. But the failure did not end Ottoman expansion. Instead, Murad shifted his attention toward the Balkans, where he rebuilt Ottoman authority through a series of victories and campaigns. He strengthened control over Serbia and Bulgaria, defeated rebellious nobles, and restored the empire's reputation as a dominant military power. Yet the greatest challenge of his reign would come not from a rival prince or a single kingdom, but from a united European attempt to reverse Ottoman expansion. In 1444, after years of Ottoman pressure in southeastern Europe, King Władysław III of Poland and Hungary, alongside the Hungarian commander John Hunyadi, launched a major crusading campaign against the empire. At the time, Murad had done something extraordinary. He had voluntarily stepped away from the throne and handed power to his young son, Mehmed II, who was only 11 years old. The decision reflected Murad's belief that the empire was secure enough for a peaceful transition. But the young Mehmed's first reign quickly became unstable. Facing the approaching crusade and internal pressure from the Ottoman military elite, the Janissaries demanded that Murad return and lead the army himself. The former sultan answered the call. Murad returned from retirement and confronted the Crusader army at the Battle of Varna in November 1444. The battle became one of the most important Ottoman victories of the 15th century. The Christian coalition, convinced that the Ottomans were vulnerable, launched a direct assault against Murad's position. But the attack failed. King Władysław III was killed on the battlefield, the crusading army collapsed, and Ottoman control of the Balkans was dramatically restored. The victory also revealed something important about the young Mehmed II. His first attempt at ruling had ended in humiliation, but the experience would leave a lasting impression on him. He had seen the dangers of weakness, the importance of military power, and the consequences of political instability. Murad briefly returned to retirement after Varna, allowing his son to rule once again. But this arrangement did not last. In 1446, a Janissary revolt broke out, dissatisfied with Mehmed's young leadership, and Murad was once again summoned back to the throne. This time, father and son would move forward together. In 1448, Murad faced John Hunyadi once more at the Second Battle of Kosovo, fought on the same region where Murad I, his grandfather, had won his famous victory decades earlier. The battle ended with another Ottoman triumph and effectively destroyed the last major European attempt to halt Ottoman expansion in the Balkans. By the end of his reign, Murad II had accomplished what seemed almost impossible after Ankara. He had taken a fractured and weakened dynasty and transformed it back into a confident empire. He restored Ottoman military strength, secured its European territories, and prepared the foundation upon which his son would build something far greater. In 1451, Murad died, leaving the throne once again to Mehmed II. But this was not the same young prince who had briefly ruled as a child and been forced aside. This Mehmed had watched his father's victories, experienced failure firsthand, and inherited an empire that had finally recovered from its greatest disaster. The city that had resisted generations of Ottoman rulers now stood before him. Constantinople was about to face its final siege. By the time Mehmed I's grandson, Mehmed II, inherited the Ottoman throne for the second and final time in 1451, the empire had spent nearly 4 decades rebuilding and expanding since the disaster at Ankara, pushing its frontiers deeper into the Balkans under Mehmed's father, Murad II, and steadily encircling what remained of a once mighty neighbor that Ottoman rulers had been probing, taxing, and besieging for generations without ever quite finishing the job. That neighbor was the Byzantine Empire, or what was left of it. By the mid-15th century, the empire that had once stretched from Spain to Syria had shrunk to little more than the city of Constantinople itself and a handful of scattered territories, its population reduced from a peak of hundreds of thousands to perhaps 40 or 50,000 people. What that dwindling population still had, though, was arguably the single most formidable set of fortifications in the medieval world. The Theodosian walls, a triple line of defenses, an outer moat, a lower outer wall, and a massive inner wall studded with nearly 200 defensive towers, first constructed in the 5th century and steadily reinforced ever since. In over 1,000 years of continuous use, those walls had turned back Avars, Arabs, Bulgars, and Rus raiders alike. No foreign army had ever broken through them by force. Constantinople's defenders had every historical reason to believe that record would hold. Mehmed II, still only 21 years old, made the conquest of that city the singular overriding goal of his reign. And he understood, better than any Ottoman ruler before him, that breaking a wall which had stood for 1,000 years would require a weapon that had never existed before. He found his answer in a Hungarian founder and military engineer named Orban, a gifted and mercenary-minded artillery specialist who had, in a detail dripping with irony, first offered his services to Emperor Constantine XI himself. The cash-strapped Byzantine court, unable to afford Orban's price or supply the raw bronze his designs required, turned him away. Mehmed did not make the same mistake. He gave Orban virtually unlimited resources, and the engineer repaid that investment by casting a bronze siege cannon of a scale barely imaginable at the time, reportedly capable of firing stone balls weighing several hundred pounds, hauled to the siege lines by a team of dozens of oxen and hundreds of men, and loud enough, according to later accounts, to be heard for miles around when it finally opened fire. Mehmed also neutralized potential threats to his rear through a series of peace treaties with Venice and Hungary, ensuring that when he finally moved against Constantinople, the city's defenders would stand almost entirely alone, with only a comparatively small contingent of Genoese and other foreign volunteers answering the city's desperate appeals for help. The siege began in early April 1453. For roughly 7 weeks, Mehmed's forces, vastly outnumbering the city's exhausted garrison of perhaps 7,000 or 8,000 defenders, pounded Constantinople's ancient land walls with continuous artillery bombardment, a tactic that had never before been deployed against the city on this scale. Orban's great cannon proved devastatingly effective against the Theodosian wall's outer defenses, though it was also slow and unreliable, capable of firing only a handful of times each day, and prone to overheating and cracking under its own repeated use. In one of the siege's most famous episodes, Mehmed, unable to force his warships past the massive iron chain the Byzantines had stretched across the entrance to the Golden Horn to block naval access to the city's more vulnerable sea walls, ordered a portion of his fleet hauled overland at night on a purpose-built causeway of greased logs, launching them directly into the harbor from an unexpected direction and outflanking one of the city's key remaining defensive advantages in a single audacious night's work. By late May, weeks of continuous bombardment had finally opened breaches in the outer walls, and the city's exhausted defenders, a mixed force of Byzantine soldiers and foreign volunteers stretched desperately thin across miles of fortification, were running out of both men and time. Command of the defense along the most critical stretch of wall had fallen to a Genoese condottiere named Giovanni Giustiniani, whose professional soldiers had become the backbone of the city's resistance. The final assault came before dawn on the 29th of May, 1453. Ottoman forces launched wave after wave of attackers against the breached walls, and twice the defenders managed to repel the assault at heavy cost to both sides. During the fighting, Giustiniani himself was seriously wounded, and against the defenders' desperate pleas that he remain at his post, he was carried from the wall to seek treatment aboard a ship in the harbor. A departure that, whether or not it was truly decisive on its own, coincided with a sudden and catastrophic collapse in the defenders' morale along exactly the stretch of wall he had been holding together through sheer force of will. Ottoman troops, discovering or being let through a small unguarded postern gate nearby, accounts differ on the precise details, poured into the city in overwhelming numbers soon after. Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI, the last Roman emperor in an unbroken line stretching back to Augustus, is said to have thrown off his imperial regalia and died fighting in the streets alongside his remaining soldiers, his body never conclusively identified afterward. By the end of that day, a Roman Empire that had endured for very nearly 15 centuries, one that had already outlived the fall of Rome itself by almost 1,000 years, had ceased to exist. Mehmed entered the city in person, reportedly riding directly to the Hagia Sophia, the greatest cathedral in the Christian world, where he ordered it converted into a mosque, a decision loaded with unmistakable symbolic weight, transforming the spiritual heart of Eastern Christianity into the centerpiece of his own new Islamic capital. He took for himself the title Kaiser I Rum, Caesar of Rome, a direct and deliberate claim to be the legitimate successor of the empire he had just extinguished. Constantinople would become Istanbul, the new Ottoman capital, and Mehmed would spend the rest of his reign earning the title history remembers him by, Mehmed the Conqueror. But the conquest of Constantinople is not, on its own, the reason this chapter carries the weight it does in the story of the House of Osman. What Mehmed did next, in the aftermath of his greatest triumph, would shape the internal politics of his dynasty for the next 200 years. And it grew directly out of the exact problem exposed by the Ankara disaster half a century earlier. Mehmed formally codified what came to be known as the Law of Fratricide, enshrining it within his broader Kanuname, the body of secular administrative law he established alongside traditional Islamic religious law to govern the newly expanded empire. The law's language, as later recorded, was chillingly direct. Whichever of the Sultan's sons inherited the throne, it was, in the words attributed to Mehmed himself, appropriate for him to have his brothers put to death in the interest of the world order, on the grounds that the jurists of the empire had approved such a procedure as necessary to prevent exactly the kind of ruinous succession war that had nearly destroyed the dynasty after Bayezid I's capture. It's worth being precise here about what this law actually solved and what it cost. What it solved was real and serious. It eliminated, at a single stroke, the ambiguity that had turned Bayezid's defeat into an 11-year civil war. A new sultan taking the throne could now move immediately and decisively to eliminate every rival claimant, rather than watching the empire fracture into competing factions, each backing a different prince. In an empire this vast, spanning 3 continents and dozens of ethnic and religious communities, a fast, brutal, unambiguous succession was, from a purely structural standpoint, a genuine improvement over the alternative. What it cost was almost incalculable in purely human terms, and it would go on, generation after generation, to produce some of the darkest episodes in the entire history of this dynasty. Moments this documentary will return to, including one sultan who would one day have 19 of his own brothers and half-brothers strangled in a single night, simply to close off every possible rival claim to his throne before it could even be raised. Mehmed the Conqueror had solved the Ottoman Empire's most dangerous structural weakness. In doing so, he had also written into the dynasty's own foundational law a permanent license for fratricide, one that would remain official Ottoman policy for the next 2 centuries, and one whose eventual abandonment would create an entirely new set of problems nobody in 1453 could have fully anticipated. Mehmed the Conqueror's own death, in 1481, immediately demonstrated exactly the kind of crisis his fratricide law was designed to prevent, and exactly how brutally it would now be enforced. His son Bayezid II moved quickly to secure the throne, but his younger brother Cem Sultan refused to accept the outcome, launching a rebellion that, when it failed, sent Cem fleeing the empire entirely, rather than face the execution his father's law effectively demanded. Cem spent the remainder of his life as a political prisoner, and pawn passed between the Knights Hospitaller, the papacy, and the King of France, each using the exiled Ottoman prince as potential leverage against his own brother's throne. A genuinely strange and unprecedented situation in which an Ottoman heir became, in effect, a hostage of Christian Europe, dying in Italian custody in 1495 without ever returning home. Bayezid II's own reign proved to be a comparatively cautious, consolidating one, focused more on administration and modest territorial gains than on the kind of dramatic conquest that had defined his father's rule. That caution would ultimately cost him his throne. In 1512, Bayezid was forced to abdicate by his own son, Selim, who had built a substantial following among the Janissaries through his reputation for military aggression and his open contempt for what he saw as his father's excessive restraint. Bayezid died shortly after his forced abdication, under circumstances that remain suspicious to this day. Selim I, who took power through this effective coup against his own father, proved to be one of the most ruthlessly effective and most genuinely terrifying rulers in the entire history of the dynasty. He fully embraced the fratricide law his great-grandfather had written, executing his surviving brothers and their sons without hesitation to eliminate any possible rival claim to the throne he had just seized. He then turned that same ruthless efficiency outward, in a reign of barely 8 years that nonetheless transformed the fundamental character of the entire empire. Selim's most consequential campaigns targeted not Christian Europe, as his predecessors had focused on almost exclusively, but the Muslim world to the Ottomans' south and east. He crushed the Safavid Persian Empire's forces at the Battle of Chaldiran in 1514, checking a serious rival power and religious challenge on the empire's eastern frontier. Then, in a lightning campaign between 1516 and 1517, Selim conquered the Mamluk Sultanate, seizing control of Egypt, Syria, and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina in the process. This conquest did more than simply add territory to the map. It brought the Ottoman Sultan for the first time into possession of Islam's 2 holiest sites, and with them, a plausible claim to the title of Caliph, the supreme religious authority of the entire Muslim world, a title the Ottomans would hold, at least nominally, for the next 4 centuries. In less than a decade, Selim I had transformed the Ottoman Empire from a primarily European and Anatolian power into something far larger, a genuine Islamic superpower straddling Europe, Asia, and Africa, with religious legitimacy to match its military might. He died in 1520, reportedly of an infected boil sustained on campaign, leaving the empire he had so dramatically expanded to his only surviving son. That son had been carefully groomed for exactly this moment, sent as a young prince to govern Ottoman provinces and gain practical administrative experience, in keeping with the tradition the dynasty had developed precisely to ensure its heirs arrived at the throne with real governing experience already in hand. He inherited an empire, at the height of its military reputation, freshly expanded into the Arab world, and holding a claim to Islam's highest religious authority. What this new sultan would do with that inheritance, expanding it further, codifying its laws, and presiding over what later generations would remember as the empire's single greatest age, would earn him a title matched by only a handful of rulers in world history. Not merely sultan, but Suleiman the Magnificent. Suleiman inherited the Ottoman throne in 1520 at around 25 years old, and would go on to rule for 46 years, one of the longest reigns of any Ottoman sultan, and one that later generations, both inside the empire and across the whole of Europe, would remember as the unquestioned peak of Ottoman power. Europeans called him Suleiman the Magnificent, a nod to the sheer splendor of his court and his conquests. His own subjects generally knew him by a different title entirely: Kanuni, the lawgiver, a title that, as we'll see, was every bit as earned as the more famous one. he wasted little time demonstrating why both titles fit. In 1521, barely a year into his reign, Suleiman captured Belgrade, a fortress city that had successfully resisted his great-grandfather Mehmed the Conqueror decades earlier. The following year, he seized Rhodes from the Knights Hospitaller, driving out the very order of Christian crusader knights who had once held his ancestor Chem's sultan captive. The most consequential victory of these early campaigns, though, came in August 1526 on a marshy plain near the Hungarian town of Mohacs. King Louis II of Hungary, just 20 years old, had assembled an army to meet Suleiman's advance, but had done so without waiting for reinforcements already marching to join him from Transylvania and Croatia. A fatal impatience born of the young king's own advisors urging an immediate confrontation rather than the delay a more cautious strategy might have demanded. The two armies met on the 29th of August, and the battle, by most accounts, was over in under 2 hours. Suleiman's artillery and Janissary infantry shattered the Hungarian lines almost as soon as the fighting began in earnest, and what followed was less a battle than a rout. King Louis himself, fleeing the collapsing battlefield, drowned attempting to cross a flooded stream in full armor as his own retreating soldiers pressed in around him. A death almost shockingly undramatic for a monarch whose kingdom's fate had just been decided in a single afternoon. Hungary's nobility was devastated nearly as completely as its king. A significant portion of the country's leadership died on the same field. The Kingdom of Hungary, one of Central Europe's most powerful states only hours earlier, effectively ceased to exist as an independent power that same day, opening the door to direct or indirect Ottoman control over large portions of Central Europe for the next century and a half. Suleiman pressed that advantage in 1529, marching an enormous army all the way to the gates of Vienna itself, the first time an Ottoman force had come close to seizing one of the great capitals of Catholic Christendom. The campaign, however, had been delayed for weeks by unusually heavy rains that turned the roads through the Balkans and Hungary into a quagmire, forcing Suleiman to abandon much of his heaviest siege artillery along the way simply to keep his army moving. By the time Ottoman forces finally reached Vienna in late September, the campaigning season was already dangerously far advanced, and the city's defenders, though badly outnumbered, had been given precious extra weeks to reinforce their walls and prepare. The siege itself lasted barely 3 weeks before an unusually early and bitter onset of autumn weather, combined with the mounting logistical strain of supplying an army so deep in hostile territory and so far from Ottoman supply lines, forced Suleiman to abandon the siege and withdraw before winter made the retreat itself a mortal danger. It would not be the last time an Ottoman army stood before Vienna's walls. A second attempt, a century and a half later, would prove to be one of the genuine turning points in this entire story. But for now, in 1529, the retreat was a temporary setback in what remained, overwhelmingly, an era of continuous Ottoman triumph. Suleiman's conquests were not confined to Europe. His forces wrested control of Iraq and Mesopotamia from the rival Safavid Persian Empire, extending Ottoman authority deep into the Middle East. His navy, under the command of legendary admirals like Hayreddin Barbarossa, seized the principal ports of North Africa, and, for a significant stretch of the 16th century, dominated the Mediterranean Sea almost without serious challenge from any single Christian power. By the end of Suleiman's reign, Ottoman authority extended, in some form, across a staggering swath of Europe, Asia, and Africa, arguably the largest and most powerful state on the planet at that moment in history. What earned Suleiman his own people's preferred title, though, was not the conquest. It was what he built inside the borders he'd already secured. Suleiman undertook a sweeping and genuinely sophisticated legal reform of the entire Ottoman state, working to reconcile and codify two previously separate bodies of law that had coexisted, often uneasily, since the empire's founding. Sharia, the religious law derived from Islamic scripture and tradition, and Kanun, the secular administrative and criminal law that Ottoman sultans, starting with Mehmed the Conqueror's own codification efforts, had been developing to govern matters scripture didn't directly address. Suleiman's version of this legal code touched everything from criminal justice and taxation to provincial governance, and was explicitly designed to reduce the ability of local governors and officials to abuse their positions, extract illegal taxes, or apply arbitrary punishment. It was, by the standards of nearly any government anywhere in the world at that time, a remarkably systematic and even-handed piece of state building, a genuine attempt to ensure that a farmer in a remote Balkan province and a merchant in Cairo could expect roughly the same treatment under roughly the same rules. Suleiman's reign also produced an extraordinary flowering of Ottoman culture, architecture, and art, centered on the imperial court at Topkapi Palace in Istanbul. His chief architect, a genuine genius of engineering and design named Mimar Sinan, would go on to design hundreds of buildings across the empire over an astonishingly long career, including the Süleymaniye Mosque, still one of Istanbul's most recognizable landmarks, a building whose scale and precision rival anything produced in Renaissance Europe during these same decades. Suleiman himself, notably, was a genuinely accomplished poet in his own right, writing verse under the pen name Muhibi, the lover, a detail that captures something real about the man behind the conquests, a ruler who saw no contradiction between commanding history's most feared army and composing love poetry in his private hours. By any measure available to a mid-16th century observer, the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent represented the absolute zenith of Ottoman power, a sultan who had expanded the empire's borders further than any predecessor, codified its laws more thoroughly than any predecessor, and presided over a cultural flowering that made Istanbul, once again, one of the genuine centers of world civilization. And yet, inside the walls of Suleiman's own palace, in the private world of his harem, a very different kind of history was quietly unfolding, one that would, within his own lifetime, begin unraveling the very succession system that had kept this dynasty stable for the past century, replacing it with something far more volatile and far more dangerous to the empire's long-term future. For roughly 2 centuries before Suleiman's reign, Ottoman sultans followed a deliberate system designed to protect the succession. Rather than taking legal wives, they kept concubines, each typically bearing only a single son before mother and child were sent to govern a distant province. The arrangement prevented any one woman from gaining enough influence at court to shape the succession in her own child's favor. In its own quietly ruthless way, it addressed the same problem as the law of fratricide, keeping succession contests centered on the princes themselves rather than palace intrigue among their mothers. Suleiman broke that pattern completely, and the woman who broke it with him would become one of the most consequential figures in the history of the House of Osman. She arrived in the imperial harem sometime around 1516, a captured slave likely taken during a raid into her native Ruthenia in what is now Ukraine. Ottoman court records called her Hürrem, the joyful one, while European diplomats knew her as Roxolana. From the moment she caught Suleiman's attention, she proved unlike any concubine before her, intelligent, politically astute, and possessed of a wit and charm that reached far beyond physical beauty. In 1534, Suleiman did something no Ottoman sultan had done in living memory. He married Hürrem. Contemporary ambassadors described the wedding as an unprecedented sensation. More importantly, it shattered centuries of palace tradition. Instead of leaving Istanbul alongside her son, Hürrem remained permanently at the heart of imperial power, established her own household, and corresponded personally with foreign monarchs, including the King of Poland. For the first time, a legal wife held a permanent place at the center of imperial politics, giving her an unprecedented ability to shape the struggle over the succession. That mattered enormously because Hürrem was not Suleiman's only son's mother. His eldest surviving son, Mustafa, had been born to an earlier concubine, Mahidevran. By nearly every surviving account, including the admiring assessment of the Austrian ambassador Busbek, Mustafa was widely regarded as the empire's most capable prince. He enjoyed the loyalty of experienced provincial governors, immense popularity within the army, and, crucially, the support of Suleiman's own Grand Vizier. That Grand Vizier was Ibrahim Pasha, often called Pargalı Ibrahim, who had himself risen from slavery after reportedly being captured as a boy near the Greek town of Parga. Long before either man held power, Ibrahim and Suleiman had formed an unusually close friendship, while the future sultan was still a provincial prince. When Suleiman inherited the throne, Ibrahim's rise was astonishingly swift. Appointed Grand Vizier in 1523, he bypassed the empire's senior statesmen and soon commanded armies, negotiated personally with foreign ambassadors, and amassed wealth and authority that made him seem almost a co-ruler. He even built a magnificent palace overlooking Istanbul's central square that rivaled Topkapi itself. Suleiman trusted him so completely that he reportedly swore never to order his execution, an oath that would later haunt them both. Such extraordinary power inevitably bred enemies. Hürrem, whose own sons stood to lose everything if Mustafa inherited the throne, is widely believed by many historians to have steadily encouraged Suleiman's growing suspicions of his oldest friend. The exact mechanics remain impossible to prove, filtered through court gossip, ambassadorial reports, and later chronicles. What is better attested is that after the Baghdad campaign, a bitter dispute over financial administration ended with accusations that Ibrahim harbored ambitions against the throne. Whether those accusations were genuine or fabricated, they reached Suleiman at a moment when his trust had already begun to weaken. The end came with almost theatrical quiet. On the night of March 15, 1536, Ibrahim dined with Suleiman as he prepared to take the throne. March 1536, Ibrahim dined with Suleiman as he had done countless times before. Afterward, he retired to his chamber inside the palace, expecting nothing out of the ordinary. He never woke. During the night, Suleiman's mute executioners, the specially trained guards who could never repeat what they witnessed, entered his room and strangled him in his sleep. By morning, one of the most powerful men in Ottoman history was dead. Contemporary accounts even noted the presence of blood, an unusual detail given that the bowstring method was intended to avoid spilling it, suggesting Ibrahim may have struggled before he died. His vast fortune was confiscated, and he was buried without ceremony in an unmarked grave, the oath that had once guaranteed his safety forgotten. The fall of Ibrahim removed Mustafa's greatest protector, but not Mustafa himself. By 1553, Suleiman was aging, and advisors close to Hürrem, including her son-in-law Rustem Pasha, now Grand Vizier, had convinced him that the prince intended to seize the throne before his father's death. Later chroniclers claimed Mustafa had secretly communicated with the Safavid Persians, though most modern historians find little convincing evidence of an actual conspiracy. His greatest offense may simply have been being too popular, too capable, and too obvious a successor. That autumn, while campaigning in Anatolia, Suleiman summoned Mustafa to his imperial tent. Trusting his father's command, the prince entered without hesitation and without armed guards. The moment he stepped inside, the sultan's mute executioners attacked. Mustafa fought with desperate determination, and several accounts describe him nearly breaking free more than once before he was finally overpowered and strangled with a bowstring. According to multiple court accounts, Suleiman watched from behind a screen or curtain, close enough to witness what he had ordered. The reaction was immediate. Mustafa's soldiers and the Janissaries erupted in grief and anger, forcing Suleiman to dismiss Rustem Pasha temporarily to calm the unrest before quietly restoring him once tensions had eased. It changed nothing. Mustafa was dead, his supporters scattered, executed, or silenced, and the road to the throne now led unmistakably through Hürrem's surviving sons. There is an uncomfortable irony at the heart of this story. At the very moment the Ottoman Empire reached the height of its military power, legal sophistication, and cultural achievement under Suleiman the Magnificent, the succession system that had preserved the dynasty's stability for generations was being quietly dismantled from within the imperial harem. Hürrem's marriage broke a tradition that had existed for a reason. The eliminations of Ibrahim and Mustafa revealed just how profoundly that single change could reshape the politics of the empire. Suleiman's eventual successor would be one of Hürrem's own sons, a choice that, as the next chapter will show, would test, in the most consequential way imaginable, whether talent or simply proximity to the right mother would determine who ruled the Ottoman Empire. Suleiman died in 1566 while on campaign in Hungary, and the throne passed to Hürrem's surviving son, Selim, a transition that went considerably more smoothly than the bloody path that had cleared the way for it. What followed, though, was a startling change in character at the very top of the empire. Where Suleiman had personally led 13 major military campaigns and had, before him, generations of Ottoman sultans who did the same, Selim II showed little appetite for the battlefield at all, earning the considerably less flattering nickname history remembers him by, Selim the Sot, a reference to his well-documented fondness for wine, itself a notable irony, given wine's prohibited status under the Islamic law his own dynasty was sworn to uphold. Selim's reign marks the beginning of a genuinely important, if gradual, shift in the character of Ottoman rule. A movement away from sultans who personally commanded armies and directly oversaw the machinery of state, and towards sultans who increasingly remained inside the walls of Topkapi Palace, governing at a remove through ministers, favorites, and increasingly through the powerful women of their own households. It's a shift that unfolded over generations rather than overnight, but its consequences would compound steadily across the following century. Historians have given this era a name that captures both its reality and its complexity: the Sultanate of Women, a period running roughly from Hürrem's own rise in the 1530s through to the later decades of the 17th century, during which the mothers and wives of reigning sultans, the Valid sultans and Haseki sultans of the imperial harem, exercised political influence on a scale unmatched before or since in Ottoman history. It's worth being careful here about how to characterize this period, because it would be both historically inaccurate and unfair to simply label it a story of decline caused by female influence. Several of the women who wielded power during this era were shrewd, capable political operators managing an empire through the incapacity, disinterest, or outright instability of the men who nominally sat on the throne, arguably providing more competent and stable governance in some periods than the sultans themselves were offering. The most formidable of these women was a woman known as Kösem Sultan, who first rose to prominence as the favorite consort of Sultan Ahmed I in the early 1600s, and who would go on to dominate Ottoman court politics for the better part of 4 decades, serving at different points as the power behind 2 of her own sons' reigns, and eventually as regent for her young grandson. Kösem built and maintained her influence through immense personal wealth, an extensive network of political alliances cultivated across the palace bureaucracy, and, when circumstances demanded it, a willingness to act as ruthlessly as any sultan who came before her. But the clearest illustration of just how unstable Ottoman succession politics had become by the early 17th century, and just how dangerous it was for a reigning sultan to lose the support of his own most powerful internal institution, comes not from the harem at all, but from a young, reform-minded sultan who made the fatal mistake of directly challenging the Janissary core his own dynasty had created 2 centuries earlier. Osman II inherited the throne in 1618 at just 14 years old, and by his late teens had grown convinced that the empire's military and political problems stemmed in significant part from the corruption, indiscipline, and outsized political influence the Janissaries had accumulated over the preceding 2 centuries. The very institution, remember, that had once been the Ottomans' greatest structural advantage over their rivals, now grown into something closer to an entrenched, self-interested political faction more loyal to its own privileges than to the throne it was created to serve. Osman began quietly exploring the creation of a new, alternative military force recruited from loyal Anatolian Muslims rather than through the traditional Devshirme system, and floated plans that the Janissaries correctly interpreted as a direct threat to their status, their pay, and quite possibly their continued existence as an institution. Rumors of Osman's intentions spread through the Janissary barracks in Istanbul with predictable speed. In May 1622, the core rose in open revolt, gathering in the city's ancient hippodrome and storming the gates of Topkapi Palace itself. They demanded the heads of the Sultan's closest advisors, and when the palace's defenders offered up the Grand Vizier and the powerful chief eunuch of the harem in a desperate attempt to satisfy them, the mob killed both, and then continued their advance regardless, unwilling to be satisfied with anything less than the Sultan's own removal. Osman, still only 18 years old, made the fatal misjudgment of believing his own presence and authority might yet calm the rebellion. He was wrong. The Janissaries seized him, stripped him of the symbols of his office, and paraded him in humiliation before the very mob that had just overthrown him. He was then imprisoned in the grim Yedikul fortress, the fortress of the 7 Towers, where, within days, he was strangled to death on the orders of the very soldiers who were nominally sworn to defend the throne he sat on. It was, in the plainest possible terms this documentary has used so far, a genuinely unprecedented moment in Ottoman history. For the first time since the dynasty's founding more than 3 centuries earlier, a reigning sultan had been deposed and killed not by a foreign enemy, not by a rival brother invoking the fratricide law, but by his own empire's own soldiers, the institution his own ancestors had built generations earlier, specifically to secure the throne against exactly this kind of instability. The Janissaries who murdered Osman II reportedly felt genuine remorse within days of the act, a mob's fickle conscience arriving, as it so often does, only after the damage was already permanent. It changed nothing. Osman's death confirmed, in the starkest possible terms, a new and dangerous political reality at the heart of the empire. The institution created to serve the House of Osman had grown powerful enough to decide, on its own authority, which member of that house got to keep the throne, and which one didn't. For the rest of the 17th century, that same tension between an increasingly palace-bound, harem-influenced dynasty and an increasingly independent, self-interested military establishment would define Ottoman politics. It would take the emergence of an unusually capable line of ministers, a rare institutional fix in an era otherwise defined by crisis, simply to buy the empire enough stability to keep functioning at all. By the middle of the 17th century, the pattern this documentary has been tracing, palace intrigue, Janissary unrest, sultans either too young, too disinterested, or too politically weak to govern effectively in their own right, had brought the Ottoman state to a genuinely precarious position. It's a testament to just how deep the empire's institutional foundations still ran, though, that the solution which arrived came not from the dynasty itself, but from a single family of ministers who, for a remarkable 3 decades, effectively ran the empire on the dynasty's behalf. That family's rise began with Köprülü Mehmed Pasha, an elderly and famously uncompromising administrator appointed Grand Vizier in 1656 under the regency of Turhan Sultan, the mother of the young reigning Sultan, Mehmed IV. Given near total authority to restore order in exchange for taking the job at all, Köprülü Mehmed moved with ruthless efficiency, purging corrupt officials, executing rivals and troublemakers by the thousands according to some accounts, restoring the treasury, and reasserting central authority over a military and bureaucracy that had drifted dangerously out of the dynasty's direct control. When he died in 1661, his son Köprülü Fazıl Ahmed inherited the position and continued his father's program of reform and consolidation for a further 15 years, extending Ottoman territory in Europe even further and continuing to shore up the administrative machinery of the state. Between father and son, the Köprülü family gave the Ottoman Empire something it had badly lacked for much of the previous half-century: competent, stable, continuous governance, purchased not through the personal leadership of the Sultan himself, but through the dynasty's willingness to hand extraordinary power to ministers capable of using it well. It bought the empire real time, roughly a generation's worth of stabilized finances, disciplined administration, and renewed military effectiveness. But it was, in the end, a temporary fix rather than a permanent one, dependent entirely on the continued rise of exceptionally talented men within a single family. And that stabilized, re-energized military machine the Köprülüs had rebuilt was about to be pointed, one final time, at the same prize that had eluded Suleiman the Magnificent a century and a half earlier, a prize whose failure this time would prove to be unrecoverable in a way no previous Ottoman setback had ever been. By 1683, leadership of the Ottoman military campaign had passed to a new Grand Vizier, Merzifonlu Kara Mustafa Pasha, a man whose ambitions matched and arguably exceeded those of the Köprülü family whose legacy he had inherited. Encouraged by an appeal from Imre Tököly, the leader of a Hungarian Protestant rebellion against Habsburg rule, who saw an Ottoman alliance as his best hope of throwing off Austrian control, Kara Mustafa persuaded Sultan Mehmed IV to authorize an extraordinarily ambitious campaign. Not a border raid, not a punitive expedition, but a full-scale assault on Vienna itself, the capital of the Habsburg monarchy, and, in symbolic terms, one of the great remaining prizes of Catholic Europe that had eluded every Ottoman sultan since Suleiman's failed attempt a century and a half earlier. The scale of the undertaking was staggering. Kara Mustafa marched north with an army historian's estimate at somewhere between 100,000 and, by some counts, as many as 300,000 men, a force that dwarfed anything Vienna itself could hope to muster in its own defense. The city's garrison, by contrast, numbered only around 15,000 soldiers, supported by armed civilian volunteers, facing odds that on paper looked close to hopeless. The siege began in mid-July 1683, as Ottoman forces surrounded the city, cut off its supply lines, and began the grinding, methodical work of siege warfare, trenching steadily closer to the walls, tunneling beneath them to plant explosive mines, and slowly grinding down both the city's fortifications and the nerves of its exhausted defenders. For nearly 2 months, Vienna held. Emperor Leopold I had already fled the city for safety, leaving its defense in the hands of professional commanders and a civilian population fighting, quite literally, for their homes and their lives. And here, one of the more consequential command decisions in this entire documentary story quietly took shape. A decision made not on the battlefield in the heat of combat, but in the calculating mind of Kara Mustafa himself, rather than pressing for a rapid, decisive final assault once Vienna's walls had been sufficiently breached. Kara Mustafa reportedly favored a more patient approach, hoping to force the city into a negotiated surrender rather than risk the wholesale destruction that a violent final storming would bring. Reasoning, as later historians have suggested, that an intact, surrendered Vienna would prove a far richer prize and a far more valuable propaganda triumph than a city reduced to rubble by his own artillery. It was a calculation that made a certain cold sense in isolation. It also cost him precious time he did not, in the end, have to spare. Because while Kara Mustafa hesitated outside Vienna's walls, an urgent diplomatic and military mobilization was gathering pace across Catholic Europe. Pope Innocent XI worked feverishly to assemble a coalition of Christian powers to relieve the besieged city, eventually persuading King John III Sobieski of Poland-Lithuania, one of the era's most capable and celebrated military commanders, to march to Vienna's aid, alongside forces from the Holy Roman Empire and several German states, uniting under the banner of what would become known as the Holy League. Sobieski's relief army reached the hills overlooking Vienna in early September, and on the 12th day of that month, launched one of the largest and most consequential cavalry engagements in European military history. As Habsburg and Allied infantry engaged the Ottoman lines from the direction of the city walls, Sobieski personally led a massive charge of heavily armored Polish winged hussars down from the high ground of the Kahlenberg, smashing directly into the center of the exhausted, overextended Ottoman position. 2 months of grinding siege warfare, combined with the psychological shock of a sudden and overwhelming cavalry assault arriving from a direction Kara Mustafa's forces were not prepared to defend, proved catastrophic. The Ottoman lines broke entirely. What had been, only hours earlier, one of the largest and most feared armies ever assembled by the Ottoman state, dissolved into a chaotic and costly retreat, abandoning its siege equipment, its supplies, and its ambitions in the same afternoon. Kara Mustafa himself survived the battle, but not its political aftermath. Held personally responsible for one of the most humiliating military failures in Ottoman history, he was executed on the Sultan's orders later that same year, a traditional Ottoman response to catastrophic failure that had claimed the lives of Grand Viziers before him, and would claim more after. But the defeat outside Vienna's walls did not end the war. If anything, it began it in earnest. Emboldened by their victory, the Holy League pressed its advantage for the next 16 years, in a prolonged conflict historians call the Great Turkish War, systematically rolling back Ottoman territorial gains across Hungary and the Balkans that had stood, in some cases, for well over a century. A rapid succession of Ottoman Grand Viziers, none matching the competence of the Köprülü family that had preceded them, presided over one battlefield defeat after another, while unpaid and increasingly mutinous Janissary regiments added political instability to the empire's mounting military woes. The war finally concluded in January 1699 with the signing of the Treaty of Karlowitz, an agreement whose terms marked something that had genuinely never happened before in the entire history of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans ceded the overwhelming majority of Hungary and Transylvania to the Habsburgs, surrendered territory in Ukraine to Poland-Lithuania, and gave up further holdings along the Dalmatian coast and in the Morea to Venice. For the first time since Osman's small band of horsemen had begun raiding Byzantine frontier towns nearly 400 years earlier, the Ottoman Empire had negotiated away major territory through a formal, multilateral peace settlement, not lost it in a single catastrophic battle, not surrendered it under the immediate threat of annihilation, but formally, permanently seated it at a negotiating table as the clearly weaker party in the room. It's difficult to overstate what a profound psychological and strategic rupture this represented. For nearly 4 centuries, the story of the House of Osman had been, with only occasional and temporary setbacks, a story of continuous territorial expansion. Each generation of sultans adding new provinces, new cities, new tribute-paying vassals to what their ancestors had already built. The Treaty of Karlowitz did not simply mark a single lost war. It marked the moment the entire direction of Ottoman history reversed, decisively and permanently, from expansion to retreat. Every chapter of this documentary that follows from here, the reforms, the reactions, the slow accumulating crises of the 18th and 19th centuries, unfolds in the long shadow of what happened and what didn't happen. Outside the gates of Vienna in the late summer of 1683, it would be a mistake to picture the 18th century Ottoman Empire as some kind of static, crumbling ruin, simply waiting out its own decline. Istanbul in this era still hosted genuine moments of cultural brilliance. The so-called Tulip era of the early 1700s under Sultan Ahmed III brought a fashionable flourishing of art, poetry, and pleasure garden architecture to the Ottoman court, along with the empire's first printing press. The Ottoman state remained, by the standards of the era, a substantial and formidable power, still commanding real armies and real territory across 3 continents. What had changed, decisively, was the empire's position relative to everyone else. To the north, the Russian Empire under Peter the Great and his successors was rapidly modernizing its army and navy, and steadily displacing Ottoman authority as the dominant power along the Black Sea's northern coast. A rivalry that would produce a long series of Russo-Ottoman wars stretching well into the 19th century, each one generally ending with further Ottoman territorial loss. To the west, Habsburg Austria continued pressing south into the Balkan territories the Ottomans had held since the days of Murad I, absorbing Hungary and reaching steadily further into formerly Ottoman lands. And across Western Europe more broadly, the early stirrings of industrialization were beginning to transform economies, armies, and state capacity in ways the still largely agrarian, guild-based Ottoman economy simply had no immediate answer for. The net effect of all this was not sudden collapse, but something more insidious. An empire that had spent 4 centuries setting the pace of events across 3 continents now found itself, decade after decade, reacting instead, responding to Russian advances, Austrian pressure, and a rapidly industrializing Europe that was pulling steadily ahead in wealth, technology, and military capacity, rather than initiating the kind of bold campaigns that had once defined this dynasty's relationship with the rest of the world. That growing gap between the Ottoman state and its rivals would, by the early 19th century, force a reckoning that no amount of cultural flourishing or diplomatic maneuvering could indefinitely postpone. A reckoning that would require one particularly determined sultan to do something almost unthinkable: turn his own empire's most storied military institution into a target for destruction. By the time Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Ottoman Egypt in 1798, it had become impossible for anyone paying honest attention inside the Ottoman government to ignore just how far the technological and military gap between the empire and its European rivals had grown. A French army, transported by sea and equipped with modern artillery and drilled infantry tactics, had landed on Ottoman territory and inflicted a series of humiliating defeats on Egypt's defending forces before eventually being driven out by a combination of British naval power and Ottoman counterattack. The lesson was unmistakable, even if it would take another generation for the Ottoman state to fully act on it. The empire's military methods, largely unchanged in their fundamentals since the glory days of Suleiman the Magnificent, were no longer remotely competitive against a modern European army. The 1820s delivered a second, equally painful blow to Ottoman prestige when the Greek War of Independence erupted into a prolonged and brutal conflict that would eventually see Greece secure its independence from Ottoman rule in 1830, the first significant piece of core Ottoman territory in the Balkans, rather than a distant frontier province, to successfully break away entirely. The conflict also demonstrated, in the most damaging way possible, just how unreliable the empire's premier military institution had become when it actually mattered. Janissary units deployed to suppress the Greek uprising performed poorly, undisciplined, and unmotivated in a war that demanded exactly the kind of professional battlefield competence the corps had once been famous for 2 and 3 centuries earlier. This is the moment Sultan Mahmud II decided to act, and to understand why his decision carries the emotional weight this chapter is built around, it's worth pausing to trace the full arc of the institution he was about to destroy. The Janissaries had begun, back in the 14th century under Sultan Murad I, as this dynasty's single greatest structural innovation, a standing, professional, permanently loyal fighting force answerable only to the throne, built specifically to escape the same feudal weaknesses that hobbled Christian Europe's armies for centuries. They had stormed the walls of Constantinople under Mehmed the Conqueror. They had crushed the Hungarian army at Mohacs under Suleiman the Magnificent. For roughly 2 centuries, they were, without serious exaggeration, the single most effective and feared standing military force anywhere in the world. But an institution built to serve the dynasty had, by the 17th century, grown powerful enough to murder a reigning sultan in Osman II, and by the 18th and early 19th centuries, that same institution had drifted even further from its original purpose. Membership, once earned through the rigorous Devshirme levy and years of dedicated training, had become in many cases hereditary and largely ceremonial, a path to guaranteed pay, tax exemptions, and lucrative side businesses in trade and craft guilds across Istanbul, rather than a genuine, ongoing military commitment. Actual combat readiness had atrophied badly, even as the corps' political muscle. Its demonstrated willingness to riot, depose sultans, and resist any reform that threatened its privileges had, if anything, grown stronger. The institution that had once made the empire unstoppable on the battlefield had become, by Mahmud II's own era, one of the single greatest obstacles standing between the Ottoman state and the kind of modernizing military reform every rational observer, inside and outside the empire, could see was now urgently necessary. Mahmud II had learned this lesson the hard way, and personally, he had survived his own tumultuous rise to the throne, partly by good fortune, watching a predecessor's earlier reform attempts collapse into exactly the kind of Janissary-led violence that had killed Osman II 2 centuries earlier. Rather than confronting the corps head-on immediately, Mahmud spent years patiently building up loyal, modernized artillery units and other forces outside the traditional Janissary structure, waiting for precisely the right moment to act. That moment arrived in June 1826. Mahmud issued a decree announcing the formation of a new, modernized European-style infantry corps, trained along contemporary military lines, a direct and unmistakable challenge to the Janissaries' institutional monopoly on military prestige and pay. The Janissaries responded exactly as history might have predicted. They rose in open revolt, overturning their traditional cauldrons in the barracks courtyard, the corps' long-standing symbolic gesture of rebellion, and marching on the palace, just as their predecessors had done against Osman II 2 centuries earlier. This time, though, the outcome was catastrophically different, because this time the Sultan had prepared for exactly this contingency. Mahmud's loyal, modernized artillery units, stationed and ready, opened fire directly on the Janissary barracks with cannon, killing large numbers of the rebelling soldiers in the initial bombardment and setting fire to the barracks complex itself. Survivors who attempted to flee were hunted down across Istanbul in the days that followed. Historians estimate the death toll between the initial bombardment and the subsequent purge in the thousands. Within days, Mahmud issued a formal decree officially abolishing the Janissary Corps altogether, ending in a single week of calculated and devastating violence, an institution that had stood at the very center of Ottoman military and political life for close to 500 years. Contemporaries and later historians alike came to know this episode by a name that captures its deliberate, engineered quality: the Auspicious Incident, a title that reflects how Mahmud's own government chose to frame what was, by any honest accounting, a carefully baited and ruthlessly executed massacre of the empire's own soldiers, undertaken by the very dynasty whose ancestors had created the corps in the first place. Sit with the full shape of that irony for a moment, because it's one of the most complete narrative arcs this documentary has to offer. An institution built by the House of Osman in the dynasty's earliest and most vigorous century to solve the exact problem of unreliable, feudally divided armies, had become, 4 centuries later, the single greatest obstacle to the dynasty's own survival. And it took nothing less than the dynasty turning its modern artillery on its own soldiers in the streets of its own capital to finally remove that obstacle. The same family that built the Janissaries to make itself unstoppable had to destroy them in blood simply to remain in power at all. It bought the Ottoman state genuine room to modernize, clearing the way for a fuller wave of institutional reform still to come. But by 1826, the empire had already been losing ground to its European rivals for well over a century, and one bloody morning of cannon fire, however necessary, could not by itself close a gap that wide. Even as Mahmud's government began building a genuinely modern military and administrative apparatus in the Janissaries' absence, European observers had already begun attaching a new, unflattering nickname to the Ottoman state, one that would follow it for the rest of its existence: the sick man of Europe. The decades following Mahmud II's destruction of the Janissaries brought a sustained, genuine effort at modernization known as the Tanzimat, literally, the reorganizations, a lengthy program of reform beginning in 1839 that overhauled Ottoman law, taxation, education, and military organization along broadly European lines, and that, among other things, formally extended legal equality to non-Muslim subjects across the empire for the first time. It was, in many respects, a genuinely serious attempt to close the gap this documentary has been tracing since the failure at Vienna. It was also expensive, and the Ottoman state, lacking the industrial tax base its European rivals could draw on, increasingly financed these reforms through foreign loans, debts that piled up so quickly that by the mid-1870s, the empire's interest and repayment obligations alone consumed more than half of its entire annual government revenue, dragging the Ottoman treasury into a formal bankruptcy that placed much of its remaining finances under direct foreign creditor oversight. Into this environment of mounting debt, recurring territorial loss in the Balkans, and a sultan, Abdülhamid II, who responded to growing unrest by suspending the Ottoman constitution and ruling through an increasingly repressive personal autocracy, emerged a new political movement determined to force change from below. Formerly known as the Committee of Union and Progress, but remembered popularly as the Young Turks, this coalition of reform-minded military officers, bureaucrats, and intellectuals, many of them educated in the empire's own modernized military academies, the very institutions Mahmud II and his Tanzimat successors had built, organized in secret for years before finally forcing Abdülhamid's hand in July 1908. Facing the credible threat of a full military mutiny, the Sultan restored the long-suspended 1876 constitution and reconvened the Ottoman Parliament, inaugurating what historians call the Second Constitutional Era. For a brief moment, it looked as though the empire might genuinely reinvent itself as a modern constitutional state. Its diverse populations of Muslims, Christians, and Jews governed under a shared parliamentary system rather than the personal will of an autocratic sultan. That hope did not survive long. In April 1909, conservative and religious opponents of the new order, alarmed by the pace and direction of change, staged a counter-coup in Istanbul, briefly threatening to unravel the entire constitutional experiment before young Turk-aligned military units marched on the capital and crushed the uprising. Abdülhamid II himself, widely suspected of at least tacit sympathy with the counter-coup, was deposed shortly afterward and replaced by his more pliant brother, leaving the Committee of Union and Progress as the empire's real, if not always officially acknowledged, governing power for the rest of the empire's existence. The young Turk government inherited an empire that was, in strictly military and territorial terms, about to suffer its single worst decade since the aftermath of the Battle of Ankara 5 centuries earlier. Between 1912 and 1913, a coalition of Balkan states, Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and Montenegro, combined their forces in the First Balkan War and, in a matter of months, stripped away nearly all of the Ottoman Empire's remaining European territory, a region the dynasty had held, fought over, and expanded through since the days of Orhan and Murad I over 5 centuries earlier. A subsequent falling out among the victorious Balkan allies produced a Second Balkan War later that same year, but it did nothing to restore what the Ottomans had already lost. By the end of 1913, an empire that had once stood at the gates of Vienna held only a small fraction of its former European territory, clustered narrowly around Istanbul itself. It was against this backdrop of humiliating and recent territorial catastrophe that the Committee of Union and Progress made the single most consequential and, in hindsight, most catastrophic decision in the empire's final decade. The choice to enter the First World War in November 1914 as an ally of Germany and Austria-Hungary. The reasoning behind that choice was not irrational on its own terms. Ottoman leaders, chief among them the influential minister Enver Pasha, calculated that an alliance with Germany offered the best available path toward recovering lost territory, checking Russian ambitions along the empire's northern and eastern frontiers, and modernizing the military with German assistance and equipment. It was, in other words, a calculated gamble by a government that had just watched its European territory collapse, and that saw, in a wider continental war, a chance to reverse that collapse, rather than simply wait for the next one. The gamble did not pay off. Ottoman forces achieved a genuine and celebrated defensive victory at Gallipoli in 1915 and 1916, repelling a major Allied invasion aimed at seizing the straits leading to Istanbul itself, a battle that would go on to shape the national identity of the future Turkish Republic, as much as it shaped the war's outcome. But elsewhere, the war went badly, and then catastrophically for the Ottoman cause. In the empire's Arab provinces, a British-backed uprising known as the Arab Revolt, beginning in 1916 and coordinated in part through the famous British liaison officer T.E. Lawrence, mobilized Arab forces against continued Ottoman rule, steadily eroding Ottoman control across the Hejaz, Syria, and Mesopotamia. Combined with sustained Allied military offensives pressing in from multiple directions, British forces advancing through Iraq and Palestine, Russian forces pressing from the Caucasus before Russia's own revolution removed it from the war, the Ottoman military position deteriorated steadily across nearly every front over the war's final 2 years. By October 1918, with its armies collapsing across the Middle East and its economy exhausted after 4 years of continuous warfare, the Ottoman government had no realistic option left but to seek terms. An armistice signed that month effectively ended Ottoman participation in the war on terms that amounted, in practical effect, to unconditional surrender. Allied warships anchored in the waters just off Istanbul itself within days. A foreign military presence sitting directly before the same capital city Mehmed the Conqueror had seized 465 years earlier. The empire that had once dictated terms to defeated enemies from the gates of Vienna now found itself, for the first time in its entire 6th-century history, occupied by foreign forces in its own capital. Its government reduced to negotiating the terms of its own dismemberment, its future no longer within its own control. What remained of the House of Osman's authority was about to be tested by one final decisive question. Would there be an Ottoman Empire left to rule at all once the peace terms were finally written down? By the spring of 1920, the answer was becoming painfully clear. Allied forces, chiefly British, French, and Italian, occupied Istanbul, reducing Sultan Mehmed VI to a figurehead under foreign supervision. Greek forces, backed by the Allies, had landed at Smyrna and were advancing into Anatolia. But the Allied plan went further than stripping the Ottoman Empire of its former territories. The harsh Treaty of Sèvres proposed carving up the remaining Ottoman heartland itself. For a dynasty that had ruled for 6 centuries, the danger was no longer simply the loss of an empire. It was the possible destruction of the Turkish homeland itself. Into this crisis stepped a decorated Ottoman general already famous for Gallipoli. His name was Mustafa Kemal. In 1919, Kemal traveled into the Anatolian interior and began building something Istanbul could no longer provide: a national resistance. He organized a rival government and army, determined to reject Sèvres and establish an independent Turkish state centered on Anatolia, the heartland from which the Ottoman dynasty had risen. And suddenly, something extraordinary happened. There were now 2 governments claiming to represent the same nation. In occupied Istanbul, Sultan Mehmed VI continued to rule in name under foreign supervision. But hundreds of miles away in Ankara, Mustafa Kemal's Grand National Assembly was building an entirely different source of power. Its government was functioning, its army was fighting. And increasingly, ordinary Turks saw Ankara, not the occupied palace, as the government fighting for their country's survival. For the next 2 years, Kemal's forces fought a brutal war of independence, chiefly against the advancing Greek army. Then, in September 1922, the balance of power shifted decisively. Greek forces were driven from Anatolia. Kemal's nationalist government was now the de facto authority over what remained of Turkish territory. The Ottoman government in Istanbul could no longer realistically govern. And now came the question: what would happen to the Sultan? The answer came on November 1st, 1922. The Grand National Assembly in Ankara abolished the Ottoman Sultanate. This time there would be no next Sultan. The institution itself was gone. After 623 years of dynastic rule, the Ottoman Sultanate had ceased to exist. Mehmed VI was initially permitted to retain the title of Caliph, but he did not wait to discover what the new government intended to do with him. On November 17, 1922, just over 2 weeks after the abolition of the Sultanate, Mehmed VI left Istanbul aboard the British warship HMS Malaya. He sailed into exile and would never return. He eventually settled in Italy, where he died a few years later, the last Sultan of the Ottoman dynasty. And there is something almost surreal about how quietly it ended. This was a dynasty that had survived palace conspiracies, civil wars, assassinations, rebellions, and ruthless succession struggles. Ottoman rulers had ordered members of their own family killed to prevent rival claims to the throne. A sultan had even been strangled by his own soldiers inside the capital. Yet when the House of Osman finally lost its throne, there was no final palace massacre. no dramatic last stand. Instead, there was a parliamentary vote in Ankara, followed by one deposed sultan quietly boarding a foreign warship. The dynasty that had conquered empires ended with a vote and an exile. But the Ottoman state itself had not yet been formally replaced. That came the following year. In July 1923, the Treaty of Lausanne secured international recognition for an independent Turkish state on terms dramatically more favorable than those threatened by Sèvres. Then, on October 29, 1923, the Republic of Turkey was formally proclaimed. Mustafa Kemal became its first president, but the revolution went beyond changing the government. The new republic dismantled many institutions that had defined Ottoman political life. Law and education were secularized, the Latin alphabet was adopted, and a new Turkish national identity was promoted, based not on dynastic and religious authority, but on national sovereignty. Then came the final blow. In March 1924, the Grand National Assembly abolished the Ottoman Caliphate. The last surviving institution of the House of Osman's religious authority was gone. The remaining members of the former royal family were expelled from Turkey. The dynasty had lost its throne, its empire, its capital, and now its religious office. But the family itself did not disappear. Members of the House of Osman scattered across Europe and the Middle East, beginning new lives as private citizens rather than princes and sultans. Their descendants, associated with the surname Osmanoglu, survive to the present day. Some have returned to Turkey for ceremonial visits, but never as rulers. They return as descendants of a vanished dynasty, and that distinction matters. Because although the House of Osman disappeared as a political power, the Ottoman legacy was far from dead. Across the Balkans, the Middle East, and North Africa, territories once governed by the dynasty still bear its imprint in architecture, cuisine, languages, religious communities, and cultural traditions. Even the political landscape of the modern Middle East was shaped, in part, by decisions made during the empire's final decades. And Istanbul itself, the city Mehmed the Conqueror captured in 1453, remains one of the world's great cities. Its skyline is still marked by monuments built during centuries of Ottoman rule, including the great mosques designed by Sinan under Suleiman the Magnificent. The dynasty disappeared. The world it created did not. And that brings us to the larger question. How did one family manage to rule for 623 years? The answer is not that the House of Osman always got things right. It survived because it repeatedly found ways to solve the crisis in front of it. A professional standing army helped the Ottomans overcome the weaknesses of traditional feudal warfare. The devshirme system produced soldiers and administrators whose careers were tied directly to the sultan and the state. Dynastic fratricide was introduced to prevent rival princes from plunging the empire into devastating civil wars. And centuries later, when the Janissaries themselves became an obstacle to reform, Mahmud II destroyed the institution that had once been one of the empire's greatest instruments of power. Again and again, the dynasty adapted. But every solution carried the possibility of becoming a future crisis. The Janissaries eventually became powerful enough to overthrow a sultan and obstruct reform. Fratricide prevented succession wars, but concentrated enormous power within the palace. The devshirme system created a powerful military establishment that eventually developed interests of its own and resisted reform. The machinery that had once helped the empire survive was becoming the machinery preventing it from changing. And this is what made the Ottoman collapse different from the fall of many other empires. There was no single afternoon when everything ended. The decline unfolded gradually. Across the 18th and 19th centuries, European states transformed their armies, economies, governments, industries, and institutions. The Ottomans recognized the danger and repeatedly attempted reforms. But reform collided with entrenched interests, political resistance, financial weakness, and institutions that had become obstacles. The empire was not destroyed because it stopped trying. It was destroyed because it could no longer change fast enough. For centuries, the House of Osman survived by solving the crisis immediately in front of it. Eventually, the world itself was changing faster than the dynasty could adapt. By 1922, there was no final battle for the Ottoman throne. There didn't need to be. The world that had made the Ottoman dynasty possible had already disappeared. And in Ankara, a new Turkish republic was ready to replace it. 623 years after Osman had gathered his followers on the Byzantine frontier and, according to tradition, dreamed of a tree whose branches would one day cover the world, the final vestige of his family's rule was gone. Not through conquest by a foreign army, not through a bloody palace coup, not through a final civil war, but through a vote, an exile, and a new nation rising from the ruins of the old empire. The House of Osman had ruled for 623 years, and when it finally fell, its greatest legacy was not the dynasty that survived it. It was the world it left behind. So, how should we remember the House of Osman? Were they a ruthless survival machine? A dynasty that executed its own brothers, strangled its own princes, and, at times, used extraordinary violence simply to preserve one family's grip on power for more than 6 centuries? Or were they the architects of one of history's genuinely great multicultural civilizations? An empire that, at its height, governed Muslims, Christians, and Jews across 3 continents, while producing remarkable achievements in law, architecture, administration, scholarship, and culture. Perhaps the most honest answer is that they were both. 623 years is a very long time for any dynasty to survive. Across those centuries, the House of Osman changed, adapted, conquered, declined, reformed, and ultimately disappeared. Its history contains cruelty and sophistication, conquest and coexistence, repression, and remarkable cultural achievement. And perhaps that is what makes the Ottoman story so compelling. It cannot be reduced to heroes or villains. It was a human story, complicated, contradictory, and shaped by generations of rulers, soldiers, scholars, subjects, and ordinary people who lived within its vast borders. So, how do you think we should remember the House of Osman? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the family that built, and eventually lost, an empire spanning 3 continents, leave a like. It genuinely helps documentaries like this reach more people who love history. And if today's video taught you something new, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.